The storm arrived as if the sky itself had remembered every wrong it had ever suffered and decided, in a single mood of cruelty, to repay the world. Rain fell in sheets that scoured the cobbles of Ashenford clean of comfort. Wind tore at shutters until they clattered like dry teeth. Lantern light struggled to slice the air. The river, swollen and furious, spat foam against its banks and sent a silver hiss into the night. In a town where every warm thing was earned and hoarded, the storm took as if it demanded back the small mercies of ordinary life. Elara Vale moved through the chaos the way one moves through a half-remembered dream, with a particular steadiness that had hardened into habit. Her cloak, patched at the shoulder with Thrift's tidy hand, was pulled tight against the rain. Her boots were thin at the sole and slick with mud. She smelled of stew and brine and the tang of dishwater, an aroma stitched to her as surely as the copper coin that always seemed a day's work from disappearing. The Lantern and Thorn Inn was a squat, honest thing of timber and smoke at the edge of the town square, its signs swaying on a single chain. Inside, the inn had the familiar stink of too many coats and too many secrets. Patrons heated their stale ale over the hearth, while gossip melted and congealed beneath the low beam of the rafters. That was Elara's ordinary. The scrape of a broom against wood, the clink of plates into the sink, the careful distribution of the last slice of bread to a child whose mother had left with no address and too many promises. It was the small, necessary work of survival. If anyone had asked her, in the honest, dangerous way people in Ashenford sometimes did, what she wanted beyond the next shift, she would have said, without false humility, only enough bread to stop that hollow feeling behind her ribs. Yet under the practical list of needs, there was a deeper truth, a private hunger. The thought of open country beyond the mossed border trees, the whisper of a freedom she had never tried on like a garment, but imagined like a sun she could not touch. People in Ashenford had a way of making you notice your place. Lord Harrow's riders passed through with the scent of cedar and cold iron. Their boots stamped the dirt as if to remind the town of its smallness. And beyond even their reach, beyond the old stone bridge and the moaning swamps, lay the forest that was not forest to some, only the eaves of the Blood Court, the fabled territory where the vampire lords kept their counsel beneath the ruined moon. Tailies were traded in the inn as easily as bread. About pale figures who walked in daylight between the columns of the ruined basilica, about children who wandered too far and were spoken for at dawn, about a king with eyes like cold garnets. The stories kept people close to their hearths and their promises. Elara had heard these tailies until they ran into the grain of her life, but hearing and believing are different things. She believed in wind and rain more than in noble curses. She believed in a steady hand on a heavy pot. There were nights, though, when the moon found her, and for a moment the mundane skin of her life slewed away. On those rare evenings she would lift her palms, calloused, honest, and notice the faint, queer shimmer against the skin at her wrist where a vein lay close. It was nothing anyone would call sensible, a subtle phosphorescence that kindled like a tremor whenever the moonlight hit just so, no louder than a memory but undeniable. She had once thought the light a trick of sleep or exhaustion. She had admitted it only to herself in the dark, and then only as a small and private terror. There were those who would call such things omens. There were those who would call them madness. Elara, practical as she was, kept the secret folded into her ribs and went about her work as if ordinary tasks could bury anything. That evening, the cellar roof of the Lantern and Thorn leaked like an old wound. A barrel had split, and the last of their salted meat threatened to spoil. There were no hands to spare save hers. Elara shouldered 2 lanterns and a crate, her back clenching as she descended into the cool smell of earth and cured flesh. The cellar was a cathedral of stored things, jars lined like sleeping teeth, sacks of grain stacked in careful darkness, the hollow smell of roots. Rain hammered overhead. Somewhere above, voices argued about the price of oats and the propriety of leaving children alone in a storm. The world above was a taut wire. Below, the state of the inn depended on a single seam of cloth that might be mended, might not. The crate scraped. The lanterns danced gold around the low stone. She moved with the small courtesy of the practiced. Elbows around beams, steps set between shelves. Then a sound, soft at first, like a breath too close to the ear, made her halt. Her hands tightened on the rope and her fingers went cold. The cellar, for all its comforts, felt suddenly like a chest hollowed of the heart. From between jars and the shadow of a leaning ladder, something moved. It was too fast to be a rat, too organized to be anything of the stable. Pale fingers like rootlets curled. A face thrust into the pool of lantern light. Eyes too large, stringy hair plastered to cheekbones too sharp. The creature smelled of rot and hunger. Its mouth opened, and the thin, wafer lips showed teeth that had learned to forget the shape of kindness. Elara's first instinct was to run. Her second was to throw the crate. The wood struck bones somewhere in the ribcage, but the thing did not fall. It scrambled like an animal learning to walk on blood and reclaimed its place between her and the ladder. A hand like a hook grabbed her sleeve. Pain, bright, white mounted her forearm as a bite cut through wool and skin. The lanterns crashed and guttered, spilling their light in small, frantic suns. Her crate tumbled and burst. The cellar became a theater of small, savage sounds. The wet smack of flesh, the hiss of breath, the thud of her own heart. She fought. There was nothing noble in the fight, only the driven will to keep standing. She struck the creature across the jaw with the heel of her palm. She felt its teeth graze her neck and tasted iron. She kneed it hard between the ribs and heard them crack like dry twigs. There was a moment, pregnant and terrible, when the thing's eyes locked with hers and she saw not only hunger but an animal knowledge of fear. It slipped. She bolted up the ladder and collared the stairs, the broken lantern sliding across the stone like a dying star. Outside, the storm had turned to a blind, unseeing beast. Elara stumbled toward the back door, the world a smear of rain and anger. The bite burned like a brand. When she looked down, a dark flower of blood had opened at her wrist, quick and intimate, beading and sliding down her sleeve. The stain on the hem of her skirt made a small, sunless map. Panic is often less grand than breath. It comes in measured gasps. She ran not for herself, though she was frightened, but because the inn needed the meat and because there were children upstairs who counted on the regularity of stews. She ran until the muscles in her legs remembered a fiercer thing, flight. She did not make it far. A pain like a bell tolled in her head, and her steps went uneven, as if the earth beneath wanted to unsettle her. She realized with a dim, stinging clarity that she had not only been bitten. She had been wounded in ways that were not to be healed by rest and a salve. Her breath came as shallow as the wind playing its claws across the roof. The town had closed behind her with the dutiful slowness of those who feared to act. Doors blinked shut like sleeping eyes. Somewhere down the lane, a dog howled a single, complaining note. Elara leaned against a post beneath a slate of eaves, and the world angled into a glass-bright clarity. Rain beaded on her lashes. Her blood, exposed to the furious sky, pulsed with a light she had never seen before, brighter, more insistent, like a coal taken from the hearth and held up to the moon. It threaded along her veins and threaded into the night. For a moment she thought she must have been dreaming the glow all along. The light seemed to answer something far away, and far away something stirred and listened. She made for the forest by way of the old cart path, because beyond the trees there were no lord's men and no prying faces, only the wind and the half-known promise of distance. The cart path was an honest thing, rutted and bracken-choked, and it led beside the river where willows leaned low to whisper. But the storm had washed away landmarks. The trees stood like identical sentinels, and she could not tell where she had been and where she had yet to be. Her foot slipped in the mud. A branch snagged her cloak and tore at the seam. The wound at her wrist burned with a heat that traveled up her arm. She left a thin line of blood on the moss, a breadcrumb path of red. If the forest sleeps, it dreams in things older than towns. It keeps time differently. Elara's breath came slow and shallow, a human metronome out of time with whatever woke beneath the roots. There was a hush that had the weight of expectation. The light in her blood pulsed, then steadied, as though listening was a practiced thing. Somewhere, as if at the turning of an enormous clock, the undergrowth parted and opened to stone. Rising from the earth like a thing that had been built from nightmare and moonlight, the crimson keep loomed. It was not, despite the local nursery rhyme warnings, a heap of ruin, but a cathedral of carved obsidian and whitened bones, towers that lunged at the sky and windows like watching eyes. Ivy had taken the mortar and stitched it into grotesque lace. Gargoyles crouched on shoulders of buttress and watched with wet, indifferent faces. The air around the keep tasted of old iron and the sharpened edge of autumn. It was, in that rain-blinded hour, both terrible and unbearably beautiful. The great gates yawned a welcoming that felt like conspiracy. They were iron and old and swung inward as if some clock inside had been wound by the exact rhythm of her failing heartbeat. Candlelight flickered along the inner walls, answering like a chorus to a single note. Warmth, impossible and immediate, washed over her as if she had stepped into an oven that remembered human touch. The steps beyond the threshold were smooth and unyielding under her boots. The hall inside opened into a cavern of shadow, lit by sconces that breathed gold. She stumbled forward and then forward again, the world contracting to the small, bright pain at her wrist, to the way her lungs seemed to complain with the effort. Her knees protested. She could not call for help. The last of her courage was a thin lace in her chest. She moved like a puppet guided by string, one hand finding a carved balustrade, the other clutching the torn hem of her skirt. The tapestries that lined the corridor depicted histories she did not know. Men with crowns, wolves with human eyes, a sun slit into two halves. Somewhere a clock chimed in a sound that might have been a human voice. From the deeper shadow, a figure stepped out. Tall, articulated, the kind of silhouette that swallowed light and promised more of the same. He had the gait of someone for whom terrain was mere suggestion. He stood like a column people leaned upon. His skin was the rarest of porcelains, his hair a dark debate against the night. He wore a coat cut to the perfection of centuries, and his hands were long and precise, the fingers of someone who had known both the fine touch of a lute and the cruel work of command. He caught her as she collapsed, not with the clumsy tenderness of an unversed hand, but with an economy of motion that suggested practice. His grip was cool against the fever of her. He bent a brow, and his face, impossibly handsome, trained into the severe lines of rule, tilted as if considering a problem on a table. There was a pool of light on the floor that reflected his eyes and made them appear the red of slow coals. He made a small, involuntary sound, a note like a key turning in an old lock when he saw the wound. He did not speak at once. He set her on the nearest settee with a care that would have been gallant in less charged company. Even in her fog of pain, she felt the thrum of power around him like a belt of cold velvet. He lowered his face until her own met his, and the light above them seemed to pool and gather like a held breath. "Who hurt you?" he asked. The words were soft, but they were not merely pity. There was an iron shaped like a question inside them, the kind of force that would name enemies and call themselves into battle. The syllables carried the echo of orders given in the dead of night, of promises sworn on blood and stone. They landed in Elara's chest and lodged there like a stone. For a breath she could do nothing but stare back at him, her vision swimming with candlelight and the rain that had been the world she had known a few hours before. Then the room tilted. The torches along the vaulted hall threw their flames higher, as if the castle itself had inhaled and the last of her strength unknotted. Her eyes fluttered like small, weary birds. He leaned closer, and his hand, cool and precise, found her wrist. The light in her blood burned bright beneath his gaze, answering the question she had never asked out loud. She did not hear the soft exclamation that might have been surprise. She heard only his voice, low and threaded with a sound she could not name, grief, hunger, and something like recognition. "Who hurt you?" he asked again, not cruel now, but as if the words were a vow he meant to keep. A warmth like sleep closed her lids. The torches flared, and the shadows along the tapestries bent toward the figure who had caught her, and then everything folded into black. Elara woke to the kind of quiet that had weight to it, an antiquated hush that seemed to hold a dozen unuttered sentences. For a breath, she thought she was still in the storm. The memory of rain against her face lingered like an afterimage. Then she became aware of the room around her, and the room was not the low-ceilinged, soot-stained chamber she knew from the inn. It was a bedchamber that had been dreamed by someone who loved dusk. High ceiling, draperies the color of old wine, a bed carved in a style that made modest furniture look like a confession. Moonlight sifted through tall windows and fell in pale stripes across a carpet patterned with wolves and crowns. A single silver basin steamed faintly near the foot of the bed. The air smelled faintly of lavender and iron, an aroma that ought to have been both comforting and wrong. She sat up as if someone had tugged a thread of surprise out of her spine. The linens slid like soft apologies. The movement did not hurt. Instead, a cool clarity crept along her calf and into her chest. Her wrist, only hours ago a ragged thing leaking blood into the mud, was whole. The bite was a pale line that could have been a scar or an echo of it. She flexed her fingers. They responded without complaint. The faint phosphorescence she had hidden so carefully under smocks and dull daylight flashed under her wrist for a moment, and then dimmed as if ashamed to be seen. Fear arrived with her blinking. Where was she? How had she gotten from the cart path to this room, this impossibly clean, impossibly well-made room? Who had carried her? The questions stacked like stones, and there was no time to inspect each one in the deliberate way she preferred. Her memories answered in slow, dangerous fragments. The cellar, the creature's teeth, the lanterns, the river of rain. Then a doorway, a shape in black, a voice asking who had hurt her, and the velveting of the world into nothing. Between those jagged pieces, a single, terrible thing settled. She had been found, and not by the soft hands of a neighbor. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, and the floor was cool beneath her soles. Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. Not the clumsy shuffle of a domestic servant, but a measured approach like someone who wore steps as carefully as one wears a blade. When the door opened, he was there as if memory had anticipated him. Lucien Draven, carved into life from rumor and the marrow of old kings. He did not bother with bows or courtesies that might have been peasant protocol. He observed as if the world were a study, and she an unusual specimen. He moved with the grace of practice, a man who had learned over centuries how to make an entrance without excess and an inspection without cruelty. His face, up close, was a landscape of severity softened by ages. The jaw was clean and certain. The mouth, when it parted in a question, made room for too much meaning. His eyes, Lucien's eyes, were more dangerous closer, because they were not merely red. They were red with memory, like coals left long enough to remember the shape of the hands that picked them up. He examined her wrist in silence, not with the curiosity of a child, but with the attention of a surgeon. "You are awake," he observed, a sentence that thrummed with the implication of permission and forecasting. "Good. You were not meant to wander." She wanted to push him, to ask what right any lord had to her, but her voice came out in a small, dry sound. "Where am I?" He did not smile. "In my house." The words landed like a stone, and then, with a rarity, something softened along the edges of his tone. "I am Lucien Draven. You fainted on my doorstep. We could have left you to the elements or less kind hands. Instead, you were brought in." She remembered the question in the hall then, the one that had sounded like an oath rather than consolation, and the way the torches had leaned closer as if to listen. "You asked me who hurt me," she said. The sentence trembled, fragile as new ice. He inclined his head. "Yes." He paused. "Why did your blood call to me?" The question yawned between them like a wound. Answering it would be answering her own life. Elara felt the urge, the animal reflex to hide, to refuse any narrative that would make her smaller or more important than she wanted to be. "I don't know," she said. "I was only trying to get back." You were hurt," he interrupted, gentle and cutting at once. "You were attacked." His voice held facts she could not deny. She had been attacked. She had bled. Why that blood had shone beneath the sky, why it had echoed in the darkness like a bell, she could not name even to herself. Lucien lifted his hand, as if to show what questions could do when they were played as instruments. "There are things in my halls that will not like having a humanized mystery in them." His gaze followed the muscle in her throat, the faint sheen beneath her skin. "You will speak with Seraphine and the steward. They will be cautious at first. I will not allow anyone to harm you within these walls." "Why would I trust a vampire king?" Elara's voice, stronger now, had a rougher edge. It was the voice of someone who had mended her own clothing and her own wounds. She did not cede her agency easily. "You admit to trust nothing," Lucien said, and in his tone there was neither sneer nor praise. "That may save you. Trust is often paid in bones." He stepped back, a courtier recalling custom. "Rest. When you are able, you will learn who you are and why your blood answered the old wards." He left her with a question that felt like a gauntlet. The bedchamber seemed to breathe after his departure, as if the walls had been holding their own breath. She lay back among the linens and watched the moon move across the heavens like a patient, indifferent god. The castle was far from the inn's known world, but comfort was comfort even when made by a hand she did not know. She fell into a restless sleep, not the heavy, guileless kind she had once known as a child, but a sleep threaded with images. Corridors like ribs, portraits whose eyes followed her, a banquet table under a chandelier of bones, and always the shape of a man asking why she bled. The castle beyond the keep's threshold moved in ways that were almost theatrical. Corridors that had seemed anonymous on first glance revealed nooks that breathed and then closed like mouths. Doors would click themselves shut behind passing servants, and then, with a soft creak, open again as if to confirm the memory of entrance. Tapestries rustled although no wind had entered, and portraits winked to one another across the span of centuries. Mirrors, long and tall and framed in black, did not always reflect her as she was. Sometimes they showed the room behind her hosting figures she did not recognize. Two queens, an animal-headed man in armor, a child with a crown too big. It felt as though the house was trying to tell its own history and could not decide on a single voice. When she walked the hallways the next day, Lucien had insisted she be accompanied by Tomas, a thin man whose half-human features made his expression perpetually surprised. She realized the castle's life was not merely an aesthetic. Voices huddled in corners, and servants moved like small, careful birds. A steward with cautious, long hands and eyes, the color of old ale, offered her tea in a cup so thin it might have been paper. Tomas, who wore the badge of the steward of Lucien's household, spoke with a hesitation that suggested he measured his words by the cost they might exact. "You must not trust anyone here without proof," Tomas said under his breath as they walked along a gallery hung with portraits. "We have old grudges in the ranks. We have families who remember old favors and older sins. A human in the castle draws interest like a flare." "I am not here to be a spectacle," Elara told him. "I am here because I was hurt." He gave her a look that was sympathy folded over something like calculation. "All the more reason to be careful," he said. "You are unusual, Miss Vale." He stopped himself, as if the wrongness of the name made the air between them crack. "Your blood has properties. We keep it safer to speak in riddles." She wanted to ask him if he knew who had attacked her, if he had seen the creature by the inn, but in the way of those who have spoken too many times with burning tongues, she kept her mouth closed. Tomas was careful in a way that suggested he had been burned before. "Who is Seraphine?" she asked instead, peering at a portrait of a woman in a gown of black feathers who looked like she might have been carved from regret. Tomas' face closed. "A noble of the court," he said. "Cold. She is old in the ways of vampiric patience. She will not like having a human near the king if there is any advantage to be taken." Seraphine herself did not like to be obvious. She preferred the architecture of disdain. She arrived at their meeting as if she had always been waiting, a shape in a room of velvet and frost. Her cheekbones were made of landscapes, and her smile looked like a closing gate. She regarded Elara as a person might appraise a coin, a quick tilt, a recognition of value, then a stash for later counting. "You survived an attack," Seraphine said without preamble. Her voice was a blade wrapped in cashmere. "The sort of survival that makes one desirable to many. Tell me, where is your family? What house claims you?" "My family tends barrels and bakes," Elara said. "No house claims me. I have no crown to speak of." Seraphine's eyebrows arched. "So you come with no pedigree, and yet you carry light in your veins," she said. "That is either an ancient accident or a business opportunity." Elara bristled. The word business turned the hair up along her arms. She had never been bought. She had been bartered for perhaps once, by a father who left too early and an uncle who counted favors. But the thought of being evaluated as currency in a court that had teeth made the blood at her throat roll like trapped water. Tomas stepped between them with a diplomatic cough. "We will not speak in markets," he said. "The king will decide. For now, Miss Vale, walk the halls, read the rooms, and watch what the portraits say when no one else is looking." The portraits did their worst work when she tried to sleep. They watched her from gilded frames, their painted eyes following the small lines of her movements. Some smiled, some scowled. One, an old woman with pale hair pulled tight like a net, tilted her head and looked at Elara with a gravity that felt like an accusation. She would not name the feeling that threaded through her sleep. The sensation that being in the castle was being made of puzzle pieces that would not sit comfortably together until some missing tooth was found and slotted. Days passed in a strange mixture of regimen and discovery. The castle fed her with hands that were old and efficient. Her wound healed and left a faint luminous stitch at the wrist that sometimes, when the moon was full and she stood in a window, glowed like a secret lamp. Lucien began to appear in the periphery of her days in a way that was both personal and politically precise. He was not present as often as a sovereign of such rumor might have been. He sent policies. He made decrees. He killed quietly when death was asked for in wine. But when he was there, he disrupted the rhythm of the household. He read maps with a tenderness for ruin. He listened to dispute with the patience of someone who had learned how long old pain fed itself. And he moved like someone who did not waste affection on things he could not claw back later. One evening, as they stood in a gallery where a storm outside made small, menacing noises upon the panes, Lucien finally spoke the words he had been circling for days. He had asked her once before why her blood had called to him. Now he offered a story like a jeweler showing the inside of a watch. "There is a curse on my line," he said. "It has been couched in rhyme and petition for centuries, passed down as a neat thing on an heirloom platter, so that each generation might wear it as both a crown and a shackle. Our blood is bound to the night in ways that make us less than gods. We do not breed in the way you think. Our line is a wound stitched to another wound." Elara listened, while his voice filled the gallery like an old song held at the right pitch. "Go on," she said. "I am not sworn to silence." He considered her then, and something like exhaustion washed across his features. "Long ago, when treaties were young and men were younger still, a house of humans, House Valeheart, entered into a pact with the blood of my kin. It was meant as protection, a marriage of convenience to keep a region safe from invaders. Over time, the pact became a chain. The Valehearts and my house became entangled. Somewhere along the centuries, the lines were blurred. There was a prophecy that when a human of that line carried the light that ends the eternal night, a living flame born in human veins, then the hold my house has overnight might end." Elara felt the room shift beneath a revelation that belonged to others. Her name, Vale, hung in the air like a bell tolling a lineage she had tried not to feel the weight of. "This is a story of kings and bargains," she said. "Why should I be the one to listen to it?" "Because your blood answered the wards," Lucien replied. "You glow when the moon touches you. You carry a blood metal that sings to our old magics. It is not mere coincidence." The idea of predestination made her want to vomit. Elara had built the architecture of her life on the ability to choose between small things. When to sweep, which child would get the thicker stew, not whom she would be told to marry, or what fate someone had set aside for her. "I don't want a crown," she said. "I want a life that is mine to decide." Lucien's expression unlatched a corner of pity that made him look almost wholly human. "Freedom is a commodity that few of those born under oaths can buy without blood," he said. "I understand that, but sometimes what we claim as choice is only the space between two levers. I do not want to force you into anything. I only want to understand why your blood called when it did." The truth, terrible and vast, was that there were court members who wanted her for reasons that were simpler and crueler than prophecy. There were those who saw an opportunity to seize arcane leverage, to break pacts and rewrite lines. Already whispers traveled the corridors. The Vampire Council convened in a room where the air seemed to thicken with old decisions. Some murmured that a living human who could bind or break ancient bindings would be worth a fortune, an asset to be traded or a threat to be eliminated. Others, the older and wearier swearers of blood, muttered of prophecies and cycles best left to die. Rumors are ravenous things. They leaped over the border into the villages. They entered taverns like strangers with maps. The human world is kin to gossip. It takes one kernel of truth and dresses it up to be both scandal and salvation. Word of a human sheltered by the vampire king, and of the possibility of ancient magic being stirred, was not the kind of news that could be kept from Lord Harrow's ears. Men who liked to believe they ruled more than they did sent riders with questions taped to their saddles. Mothers looked at their children warily, keeping them close like a secret. In the castle, the servants spoke in undertones, and in the council chambers, some smiled for the promise of advantage while others, the older, grimmer sorts, felt the old fear twist under their tongues. If such a change occurred, if the night were to end, who would they become? Elara watched Lucien in the midst of these currents and began to see the two faces of him as a scholar might study a coin, the minted side and the turned edge. There was the monarch in him who weighed players and plots, and whose decisions were measured in decades. There was also the private man who had quieted a room with a look, and who could, in a sudden fracture of temper, break a body with hands not used to gentleness. In the way he hovered near her, there was a protective violence she could not be sure she wanted nor entirely resent. He was, she realized, both armor and blade. For all that, unnoticed moments revealed things no rumor could forge. In the mornings, he walked the ramparts and looked at the horizon, as if memorizing where dawn might one day bleed. When he thought no one watched, he would touch the hilt of a sword and sigh as a man who had used the same phrase too often. I remember when. He could be savage defending a hallway of servants, tearing through mutineers like a storm, and moments later he would be tender with a book of poems, reading soft lines aloud just to hear them break the silence. The combination of those natures was frightening and attractive in equal measure. It pulled at the strange places in Elara that had always believed in complexity rather than in neat binaries. The masquerade, if the word could be used when the chandeliers were red and the music had teeth, was both political theater and a balm. Seraphine proposed it with a smile too elegant to be honest. Let us see what masks men and women choose when offered wine. The castle responded by stirring ancient fabrics and opening trunks that had not been washed of dust for generations. Feathers were sewn to sleeves. Masks were gilded and designed to suggest more than they hid. The great hall was strung with chandeliers of wrought iron and glass that bled a deep, sanguine light. Beneath them, tables were set with crystal and things that looked like they had been crafted from moonlight. Servants passed plates lined with things that glowed faintly. An affectation some thought gauche and others, including Seraphine, considered necessary when old grudges were to be put on spectacle. Elara, against her instincts, was compelled to attend. Seraphine insisted that she wear something that changed the geometry of who she was. A gown that made her shoulders noble and her waist small, coral threads catching candlelight in ways that made the texture of her skin seem like a story. Seraphine herself moved through the hall in black silk, an orchestration of chill. Tomas fussed, as if the smallest seam might be a treaty. "You look like someone out of a legend," he said, and for once his voice was not precaution but awe. They fastened a mask over Elara's face, not to hide her so much as to teach her to be seen at a certain distance. Masks at such events are instruments of honesty. They permit confession because they permit secrecy. In a sense, the mask told the court it could approach without wielding the bluntness of papery truth. The hall thrummed with music that was half chant and half percussion. The dancers slid like shadows across stone. Lucien waited at the edge of the floor like a king who had worn his crown for too long and had grown bored of the wait. When their eyes met, it was not a casual notice, but a recognition like two ships acknowledging the same harbor. He extended a hand that might have been a summons, and she took it though her fingers trembled. The contact was a declaration that neither wanted to speak aloud. They moved as two people trying to make a fragile thing out of a dangerous machine. The dance was a conversation of bodies. Small intimacies measured in inches and long glances that held the shape of unspoken confessions. For a moment, the world narrowed to the two of them and the red glow at the chandeliers, and she fell into the kind of hush that made the rest of the court seem like a choir of irrelevant noise. Then the air changed. The scent shifted, metal, old coin, the tang of blood delivered under intention. A rival lord, a viscount of the outer marches who had long coveted Lucien's influence, made his move. He struck like the man he had always been. Blunt, loud, confident that noise and numbers could bury truth. His faction surged forward, knives catching the chandelier light, and the hall erupted into a choreography of claws and desperate grace. Instinct is not taught. It is a muscle that remembers older scripts. Elara did not think of prophecy or fear of being seen. She thought only of the man under her hand, the one who had offered her sanctuary and then been offered danger for it. Her wrist flared, bright, fierce, the phosphorescence of her blood igniting as if a match had been struck. The light bloomed along her veins like small suns and leapt outward in a shockwave that flung back attackers and sent goblets shattering in the air. The glow was not merely illumination. It was a force. It did not burn like flame so much as it revealed things. It showed allegiance by painting faces for what they were. It exposed plots by making shadows withdraw as if embarrassed. For a moment the hall held its breath. Lucien, who was in the center of the melee, looked up and met her gaze. There was awe there, raw, unscripted, and terror braided through it like a second thread. She had not meant to reveal herself. She had meant only to push back the blade toward the man who would have killed for power. But when the glow flared, it did more than shield. It declared. It betrayed a lineage she had tried to keep private, a blood-wrought name that slid like a banner over her head for all to see. The court's laughter fell into silence, and the music stuttered to a stop. Seraphine's eyes were narrowed to a thin slit of appraisal. Tomas's face had gone pale as milk. Lucien moved toward her then, parting those who flocked like birds around a nest. He did not look vengeful. His face carried a new set of feelings, defense combined with a perilous pride. The council was awake to the truth now. Elara Vale was not a simple servant. She was a fulcrum someone might use or fear. The whispering began again, lower and more dangerous than before. The castle, which had been a chorus of moods, seemed to brace as if itself had drawn in breath. Elara's heart hammered beneath the scarlet lace of her gown, as if in the knowledge that nothing in the castle would be the same after the night she had turned her blood into a signal flare. The betrayal arrived like a hand closing on a throat, a soft, necessary gesture that killed the chance to breathe. Tomas had learned the art of useful lies a long time ago, how to shape his words so that they felt like aid and not like iron. He had been the steward who carried messages, the thin man who smoothed wrinkles in other people's grief and made sure the hearth never quite went cold. Lucien's household had given him the small power of being useful. That usefulness had a price. It happened on an evening that smelled of rain and old coin. The hall smelled of the iron-sweet tang that always rose before a mutiny, the scent of polished blades and tenacious envy. The rival viscount, the one who had cut across the masquerade and found wounds to pry at, was cleverer than bluntness. He spoke in promises that sounded like futures. He offered Tomas a vial whose surface held the color of moonlight in a bottle, and the soft assurance that it would buy him length of days beyond what mortals were allotted. He told tales of secrets tucked away beneath the ruins of his march, of an alchemist who had learned to rent out the hours of life in exchange for service. He said only the court's most dangerous leverage could open such a thing. Tomas had been careful. The offer should have been returned to the table and left to rust. But the desire in his eyes, sharpened, familiar human, was not for wealth or for titles. It was for the small terror of being left small in a house of monsters when time stretched and no one remembered him. "I have spent my life measuring things," he whispered to the Viscount. "What is measured cannot be taken away. What is kept safe can be kept for a man who is clever." The Viscount smiled like a man who had always been good at purchase. So Tomas fashioned a gift of himself. One night, when moonlight pooled thin and Lucien had been delayed in council, he led Elara on the pretext of showing her a library where she might pass the long hours and learn. He said, "The histories of House Vale." She followed with the caution of someone who had been taught to answer those who offered books as comfort. At the edge of the library, a second figure rose from shadow. A man of rougher build than the Viscount of the Masquerade, draped in a cloak that had seen better wars. The man's fingers were quick. He took Elara as if she were a thing that might still be bartered. No words, no ceremony. Tomas watched, pale as a sermon, as the traitor of immortality took her and strapped her to a horse that had not been Lucien's. When Lucien learned of it, the castle itself felt the rhythm of his anger. It was not the white-hot flare of madness, but an ancient, volcanic shift that swallowed the sun in the room. He tore through corridors in a way that suggested he intended to rend the walls and pry secrets loose by force. He moved with every old training of a warrior and every sharper instinct of a king. The guards who tried to stop him were swept aside like leaves. The Viscount's men met him in the courtyard, under the low skies that had not yet learned what would come. Lucien's rage was monstrous and terrible to behold. He shredded the enemy lines with hands that were precise and inexorable. He tore armor off men and flung bodies like rag dolls. There was a sound in his advance, a tearing of cloth and a collapse of pride, that made older soldiers step back and mutter oaths. Yet with every perpetrator that fell, a darker thing happened. The blood spilled and the moonlight fed not just wounds, but an old law. The ancient curse that draped Lucien's line, it hung on certain rules, certain ironies, grew like a shadow at the edges of the spectacle. Each drop of spilled vidi, each crushed heart dueled in combat, seeped into a spell woven long ago. The curse was a thing that fed on violence, on the currency of frantic, mortal blood. It coagulated with each outrage, binding the night more tight. Elara watched from where she had been held, the ropes at her wrists cutting shallow half-moons into her skin, and realized in an instant that felt like the cracking of an egg what the true cost would be. Saving Lucien by letting rage have its way meant fueling the very bond they wished broken. The paradox bit her like frost. She had been taught, as a child by an absent mother and a deceptive uncle, to think of sacrifice as something you gave only when there were no other hands to reach the bread. Now she saw another truth. Sometimes the bread you gave might feed a flame that ate the world. In the days that followed the skirmish, the castle reeled. The Viscount's men were scattered like ash on the wind. The wounds Lucien inflicted were surgical and absolute. Yet as Lucien stood in the Hall of Mirrors with his cloak damp from battle, his face was a study in exhausted horror. He had defended. He had avenged. He had, in doing so, tightened a noose he had sworn to loosen. The council met in odd hours, voices low and edged. Seraphine watched with the cold patience of someone who read the terms of contracts and saw the clauses that could not be undone. "You see it, do you not?" she asked Lucien in a tone that could have been pity if her pupils had not glinted like knives. "Blood breeds binding. Men spill blood and the world pays for it." Lucien closed his eyes for a fraction and opened them to a new hardness. "Then I will find another way," he said. The words were steadier than his hands, and they carried the weight of a man who had kept promises until they had no meaning left. But he also knew the truth had teeth. Sometimes no other way existed. It was Seraphine who brought the old parchment forward during one council. The letter was a scrap wrapped in leather, its edges eaten by time and smoke. It spoke in the clipped script of a long-dead chronicler. "When the night has grown thick as a crown, and the blood of the old pact yet sings in young veins, the chain may be unbound only if one of the blood-bound lays down life willingly. The willing may be human, may be vampiric. What is necessary is the will, uncoerced and unashamed." The parchment fluttered as if it were breathing. A silence like drowning followed. The room was a taut thing. Even those who had once laughed easily seemed to find their laughter stuck like a cough. Elara sat at the edge of the chamber bench, and the words slotted into her like a hammer. She understood, in that quiet clarity, that the chain asked for an offering of its own. It did not care for justice measured in deeds or for vengeance served in kind. It asked for the rarest currency, a life given wholly because the heart chose to give it. She could have chosen flight. She could have asked Lucien to take her away in the fury he carried. She could have fled to some other hidden ruin and attempted to live. But fleeing, she realized, would be a coward's bend at the stem of a flower. The curse would continue, fed on other blood, gnawing on the marrow of centuries. She saw instead the faces she had known, children in Ashenford who learned fear instead of the catechisms of life, a town molded by the long night under the shadow of the blood court, a future where the waking world despaired of dawn. Elara's decision was not theatrical. It was a small, steady flame, that rose from a life that had been used to choosing the softer tasks, and then discovering that softer things sometimes require hardest courage. She told Lucien first, when the night lay like a sheet over the castle and the moon pressed a chill into the windows. He listened like a man who had practiced patience, like a man with the time to do so, but there were cords of fear braided into his restraint. "You cannot ask me to do this," he said. The sentence was both plea and refusal. His voice broke in the way of someone who had buried sons and lovers and vows. The sound was brittle and therefore real. "I do not ask you," Elara replied. "I choose." The word left her like a seed. "The prophecy asks for willing blood. I am veil by line and I have light in my veins. If there is any way to end this, if there is any way to give dawn back to a world that has forgotten how to hope, then I will be that willing thing." His hand took hers then, a movement full of coercion that had no right to be tender. Lucien's face was not monstrous with acceptance. It was suffused with a kind of sorrow that made him ache. "I have waited centuries for redemption," he said, words shaped with old regret. "I have waited for a hand to reach into this seam and pull out the man I might have been if I had not been made through bargains and blood. I have waited for someone to teach me that mercy is not weakness. And I find it in you." They kissed then, brief, imperfect, a press of two fugitives against a sudden cliff, and confessed the thing that had been muttering in both of them in small, private ways. Confession had the nakedness of a bargain, dangerous, honest, and necessary. They spoke of small domestic things that would never have been, of bread in a sunlit kitchen, of Lucien learning to let children sit without fear in his lap, of Elara wearing a dress that could get dirty without it being declared a sin. They spoke of the night. They spoke of the long history that had made them who they were and of the strange mercy that had thrown them into each other's paths. "We will do this together," Lucien murmured, the decision in his voice less a ruling than a promise. "I will not let you stand alone in a place where light has been outlawed." So they planned. The ritual, as the parchment had suggested, required a place where the boundaries of the old magics thinned and the architecture of binding could be exposed. The Hall of Thorns was chosen, a place where ancient oaks had been coaxed into a lattice of living wood and iron, where the ceiling arched into a ribbed lattice, and a skylight had once invited the sun. For centuries it had been barred to anything bright. The vines that wound about its columns had been woven from curses and old loyalties. There, beneath a sky that had not known dawn for generations, the sacrifice might be offered and the old stitches might be taken apart. The night of the ritual arrived like the long inhale before a blow. The Hall of Thorns was a cathedral of shadow and spikes. Its walls were slick with old sap that hardened like varnish on bones. The court gathered with faces that had been stripped of their masks by the gravity of the moment. Some, those who had power to lose, sat with expressions that were rehearsed and impenetrable. Others, young, raw vampires whose teeth had not yet learned the taste of centuries, gazed with hunger at the stage where a life might be rebalanced. Elara stood at the center, her wrists unbound and her blood collected in a simple silver cup. The light in her veins pulsed like a living thing. It did not roar, but it hummed, a deep, bright vibration that ran up the spine of the world. Around her, men chanted in the old tongue, words that smelled of iron and rain. Lucien stood by her side, his hand at the small of her back, a shield of bone and regret. He wore the king's cloak but kept it off his shoulders as if to let it not disturb the ritual's openness, an act that made him look less like a monarch and more like someone who had learned to be small to be true. The rites were a mix of poetry and pain. The parchment had declared that the willing must offer not only life but intention. The will must be iron and uncoerced. Elara spoke those words aloud, slowly, like someone reading the last page of a beloved and terrible book. She let Lucien touch the cup to her lips. He drank not to claim life, but to witness the offering. He tasted her blood, and with it the full life of a woman who had known both hard years and small joys. He saw in it not only magic but memory, bread, a child's face, the breach of a crooked promise. "I will not take this from you," he said, but his hand trembled as he touched the cup. She lifted it herself. Her voice was small and perfectly clear. "I give willingly," she told the hall, and the words were too bright to be untrue. The instant she let the liquid leave her, there was a sound like 100 bells breaking. Light uncoiled in the Hall of Thorns, with a ferocity that none had believed possible. It shattered the vines that had girdled the ceiling. It peeled back the black film that had crusted over the skylight, and it struck the faces of the gathered like a blade. The curse shrieked, an animal torn from the throat of night, and with its cry, the very foundation of the castle seemed to sigh as if relieved. But breaking was not clean. The Viscount's faction, present to watch the end and perhaps to seize the new order, moved to take advantage. Blades clashed and the hall spilled into chaos. Lucien became a tempest. He moved from enemy to enemy, protecting Elara's shrinking body as if he alone were tasked with keeping the sun within reach. He struck with the precision and economy of a man who had killed for ages. His blows were poetry and murder braided together. Wounded men fell, and with each drop of their blood the old law, stubborn as rust, tried to regain purchase. The curse fought back, pulling at the threads the ritual had begun to unweave. Elara's life disintegrated like light through glass. The sacrifice had been given, the ritual had been lit, but such turns are rarely swift. She felt the warmth leave her bones like water through a sieve. Her breaths came in thin, grateful gasps. Lucien's face hovered over hers, streaked with sweat and old blood, his expression a map of grief too wide to be contained in a crown. "Do not leave me," he said, though how one could cage the movement of a heart was beyond both of them. "I will not be gone," Elara whispered. "I will be where the dawn is. I will be where children can learn to run without fear." Her fingers curled around his, their palms a small island in a sea of fury. "Promise me something, Lucien." He leaned close and pressed his forehead to hers, where the hairline had been damp with sweat and dust. "Anything. Promise you will remember," she said. "Even if you think you have nothing left to remember, remember my name without calling it a tool. Remember the taste of bread we both wanted. Remember not to make bargains you cannot keep." She smiled once, a small, private thing that made his throat work. Lucien's throat moved. He had the sense of a man who knew how to lose and how to hold. "I promise," he said, and the word made a small, monstrous sound in his chest because promises used to be metal, and now they were all that remained. She let the last of her light go then, a thin wash that bubbled in the cup and rose in tendrils that joined the skylight's fractured seam. The light leapt upward, and the cracks along the vaulted ceiling widened like mouths finding new words. For an instant, the hall was full of dawn, color and heat that no one under the blood court had touched for centuries. It was beautiful and terrible. Windows shattered with a sound like glass laughter, ivy that had coiled whole histories around pillars withered into dust, and the creatures who had relied on perpetual dusk found themselves exposed on the stage of day. In the dreadful brilliance, there was a finality that made men who had been cruel look suddenly small and ashamed. The Viscount's men, those who had sought advantage, stood briefly stunned as the world recoded itself. The power that had fed them slipped like sand from a clenched hand. Elara lay back as the light splayed over her face. Her breath grew thin. The ritual had taken its due. She saw Lucien's lips move above her, forming words that sounded like forgiveness and like pleading. She smiled. The movement was small, nursed by a woman who had learned to find joy in dirt and small tasks. "Do not be cruel to yourself," she said. "Live, let the world be sun." She closed her eyes to the rising. Lucien knelt and pressed an old monarch's gentleness to her, an act so private and savage that it defied the public spectacle of their victory. He put his mouth to her wrist and drank, not because he sought the warmth of immortality or the bite of life, but because he desired to carry something of her across the seam she was crossing. The wine that touched his lips was not merely blood. It was memory and promise, and the honest, unvarnished truth of a hand that washed dishes and had once been given nothing. He tasted the bread, the rain, the cellar's sweat. He tasted small things that had never been meant for kings. As the last of her blood left her body, and his lips closed over skin that would never warm again, something like a bell tolled through him. The cupola above flared, a bloom of light, and in that flare Lucien's form was washed in radiance. He sat back, his face a mixture of the feral and the holy, and he said her name as if it were a benediction. "You were the light I was cursed to find." His words were the last thing she heard, And then the dawn rose and took them both in its open, indifferent hands. Years had a way of softening sharp things. Stone edges wore into gentler curves. Old griefs thinned into stories told at firesides. Where once the night had been a kingdom unto itself, the world learned again how to keep mourning. People in Ashenford planted gardens where they had once kept lanterns forever lit against the dark. Children grew up knowing the taste of dawn on their tongues and the meaning of sun on a face instead of the rumor of it. The tales that grew from the old events layered themselves like varnish over bones. Some spoke of a vampire king who had burned himself for love. Others told of a servant girl who bled and became the dawn. Songs turned in taverns, ragged, beautiful things, about a crown that had been traded for a loaf of bread, and about a hand that chose to give rather than to take. Sometimes truth and legend braided in inconvenient ways. The Crimson Keep did not crumble into immediate ruin as stories liked to insist. It changed. Ivy that had once eaten its stones browned and fell. Windows that had held shadow now caught the sun and threw it back in shards across the dry sills. Pilgrims came, not in great numbers at first, but in a steady trickle. An old woman who claimed to have seen Lucien on a roof, speaking to the gulls. A boy from a neighboring village who swore his mother had touched a memory of Elara when they ate the last slice of stale bread together. People left offerings in the outer courtyard. Crumbs, glass beads, a ribbon tied in a child's hair. Small things that felt like apologies the world owed itself. Further from the keep, in a place where the map swelled into rough country and then into nothing more than rumor, a monastery sat like a punctuation mark on the clifftop. It was built of granite and stubbornness, founded by men and women who preferred the measured life to the insistence of courts. Monks there kept schedules like prayers: bell at dawn, bell at noon, bell at dusk. They grew their herbs in boxes of patient soil. They mended their robes in long, deliberate stitches, and they read the old chants until the margins of their books wore into private languages. Among them was a novice whose hands were not yet fully calloused by the work of holy repetition. Her name was Myra, though the monks shortened it sometimes to a sound like a question, because she carried questions in the pitch of her voice. She liked the quiet places where dust settled in meaningful ways, and where objects could be handled with reverence. Myra's life was made of small certainties: sweep a floor, bind a book, wake before the sun. But she had a hunger for things that did not fit their neat order. She collected stories the way other novices collected rosary beads, one for each thing they could not quite understand. It was in a storage room that smelled of wax and old vellum that Myra found the mirror. It sat behind a stack of prayer boards, wrapped in cloth that had once been a banner and embroidered with patterns that looked suspiciously like thorns. When she unfurled it, the glass looked like a pond that had been left to cool. The frame was carved in a style that tasted of another court: winding vines, faces half-formed as if someone had sculpted them and then changed their mind. At first it seemed only old and lovely in the way that things in the monastery were, objects that had outlived their owners because the owners preferred them to the living. But when she caught her reflection, something in the glass flared, a thin, crimson thread like a pulse, and for a startled second the surface did not show only her face. It showed a hall, long and lined with tapestries, and a woman on a bed of linens whose wrist shimmered like dawn. The image lasted the length of a slow breath and then was gone, as if the mirror had merely indulged in a private memory. Myra could have told herself that storage rooms were full of mischief, and that tired eyes played at seeing. She could have rationalized the flash as the trick of candlelight. Instead, she wrapped the cloth back around the mirror and took it with her to the small refectory where she catalogued odd donations for the abbey. The mirror sat on a low table as if timid, and each time she passed it her curiosity pulled like a string. On a night when wind came in sheets from the sea and the monastery bells were muffled by weather, she heard it. A voice, very near, that folded into the air like a hand slipped into a glove. It did not come from another room but from the glass itself. It was an old voice and a very young voice at the same time, both memory and question. Myra froze with the wash of it. "Who hurt you?" the voice whispered. It was a phrase she had heard in fragments, in the market as an old woman soothed a child's knee, in a song a pilgrim had muttered about a queen. in a moment of private reading when she had turned a page and found it echoed back. In the mirror, the words were threaded with something else, a softness and a demand. It was an inquiry that did not want to fix the past so much as to know it. Myra touched the glass. It was not cool as a pond, but warm as a forehead. The reflection shifted. Now it showed a corridor lined with portraits that watched the woman who moved through as if awaiting a verdict. It showed the same wrist Myra had glimpsed before. And then, impossibly, a hand reached toward the surface as if seeking her. The woman who pressed her face to the panes of Myra's mirror looked like a memory assembled from several lives. A servant's hands, a noble's carriage, a child's habit. Her mouth opened, and the same whisper flowed out like smoke. Myra could have run to the prior and demanded the mirror be locked, or she could have smashed the glass and been done with the unrest. Instead, she sat until the dawn found the horizon thin and a soft gold rinsed the tiles. She listened and learned that the mirror spoke not only in echoes of pain, but in small kindnesses. Names shared in the dark, the recipe for a loaf that 1,000 hands had tried to perfect, the way a river sounded when it held no fear. It was, in the way that small things sometimes are, a relic of remembrance. Other novices noticed changes. The bell tower's old echo took on a new cadence. The herbs in the kitchen seemed to taste better, as if the sun played through them more honestly. Pilgrims left coins that bore strange marks. Sometimes a ribbon appeared on the doorstep with no one to place it. When word of the mirror reached the cloister elders, some wanted to entomb it. Fear, after all, is a loyal guardian of peace. Others thought it a thing to study, an object that tethered lives to stories so that no one forgot how costly dawn had been purchased. Myra, who had once longed only for certainties, found herself with a new gentle duty. She would sit, after the third bell, with the mirror before her and listen to the voices trapped in its amber. They were not always plaintive. Sometimes they were joyful, as if the things that had been lost were being given back in small increments. The mirror taught her how to ask questions that were not accusatory, how to unhuge grief into a shape that could be held without tearing. It taught her that some wounds ask for a witness rather than for healing. On an afternoon when the sun was especially kind, a stranger came to the monastery, a man moved thin by both years and storms. He asked, in a voice like a closed door, if the abbey kept relics of the old court. The monks were careful with such requests, and Myra was careful in turn when she fetched the mirror and set it on the table. The stranger's hands trembled when he touched the frame. He did not speak of names, but his eyes weighted the glass as if looking for a map. He did not stay long, and when he left a small thing upon the sill, a shard of stained glass, red as a bead of blood, wrapped in linen that smelled faintly of lavender. It was not an answer. The stranger had given no explanation and would not be tracked. He had the road in him more than the desire to belong to a story. Yet his gift felt like the continuation of a conversation. Myra polished the shard, and as she placed it next to the mirror, the glass flashed and the old voice asked, as it had that first night, "Who hurt you?" But there was, beneath it now, a sound that might have been gratitude, soft, reluctant, like a tree that has learned to bend to weather without breaking. The mirror did not give her the relief of finality. It offered instead the persistent, human thing it had always held, the invitation to remember, to tend, to keep watch. Outside the monastery, the world had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Men who had been born under the long night now talked of afternoons as if they were a good thing to be cautiously trusted. Children played long into the evening, and lovers learned again the careful work of staying. Inside the mirror, though, the thread of the old magic hummed. The last thing Myra heard on that first morning as she set the shard into its nook and swept the crumbs from the table was the whisper, again, like a bell that had not finished tolling. "Who hurt you?" She did not answer in words. She pressed her palm to the glass and felt the faint beat of something beyond the shape of a face, an echo or a promise. Somewhere the world turned toward another day. Somewhere else a question still waited for an answer. The cycle folded upon itself like a page and kept its secrets. The dawn had come, but the asking had not stopped.